it's really interesting that we have one bottom-up guy here who doesn't need much investment, and then we have Light Squared, which is top-down. They're distributing everything from satellites, and they need billions of dollars. I think before we go any further, I'd like to ask the panelists' opinions, and people in the audience are welcome to join in. Just what is broadband, and what is broadband wireless? You know, the FCC said that half the country or most of the country will have broadband, and what does that mean? And then how is that related to broadband wireless? So who'd like to, which of the panelists would like to tell us? Okay, Bart, thanks.
So my personal view is that broadband is an oxymoron because bandwidth refers to an analog spectrum, and everything we're talking about here is digital to start with. But even ignoring that, the basic drivers that we're talking about here are ease of use. You want to be able to get content whenever you want it, in whatever form, voice, data, video, that you want it. You want to be able to store it. You want to be able to look at movies. You want to be able to do all of these different things. And so under this umbrella of, and no wires, no wires in this. So in fact, broadband wireless is quite ubiquitous because we have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of Linksys and D-Link routers out there that permeate everything. And all that will happen is that it's kind of like kudzu, they'll come up from the bottom and you'll just start to see them spread their tentacles going elsewhere. So glad to get other people to sound off.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just give you a technical view of that because you will hear this very often. Broadband, as per ITU, the governing body in telecom, is 1.5 and 2 megabits per second primary ISDN, higher rates than primary ISDN. But I think the question is the current definition of broadband relevant in future? Because if you look at broadband, I think it's really broad. If you look at today, it starts from 1.5 megabits per second as per ITU, but it can go right up to 1 gig. We are talking in about 10 years time frame. So it's broadband is really broad.
And what's Light Square's view of this? Because you're providing much broader bandwidth with your LTE.
But probably I would go for a user or usage-based definition. Broadband today primarily is being able to use what you can find on the internet from anywhere on any device. And on the internet there is a lot of video streaming. So the underlying technology has to be good enough to provide good quality video. That's today. Tomorrow it will be HD video, 3D graphics, so it will continue and increase. But for today, I would say streaming video over the internet is probably the good benchmark to assess whether you've got a wireless broadband connection or not.
But it's a moving target, do you think?
It's a moving target.
And what do you think of what these guys are saying, that we already have broadband everywhere, is what Bart Stuck said, and Dana Spiegel said we don't need much investment to get there, we could just build it from the bottom up. So where does Light Squared fit into this?
So I think I would support the analysis of the FCC in their National Broadband Plan, saying that in the face of probably a 50-fold increase in mobile data usage in the next 5 years, there isn't enough spectrum in the US to satisfy that demand with cellular technology. And as Light Squared, we have spectrum that was satellite-based spectrum originally that has been authorized for terrestrial usage 8 years ago through successive authorization. And we are the only source of new spectrum available today to provide additional capacity on the market. If you look at what's happening on the US market today, only 2 4G LTE networks have been announced and are being rolled out, Verizon and AT&T. None of the other wireless operators have enough spectrum to roll out a 4G LTE network in the country. So what we intend to do is to be the third 4G LTE infrastructure and to sell our capacity to the existing wireless carriers who haven't got 4G spectrum or haven't got it nationwide or haven't got it in enough quantity. Let me give you one example. Till now it has been very difficult for rural operators to offer competitive service because they could deploy a network on their particular rural territory, but were not able to give their customers a nationwide roaming coverage because it was prohibitive from a price point of view. So what we did, for instance, recently with Cellular South is to enter into a reciprocal roaming arrangement for 4G traffic. We would pay them for roaming on their network what they would pay us. And that number would be a single-digit dollar per gigabyte. So an order of magnitude lower from what you can pay on the market today. You don't find a gigabyte lower than $40 today. So single-digit dollar, it's really an order of magnitude of difference. So all of a sudden, we are allowing a rural operator in a rural territory to be competitive. They will be deploying LTE themselves on a particular footprint, but they will be offering nationwide coverage to their customers thanks to the agreement with us. And we are in the process of announcing half a dozen of similar agreements with other rural partners.
It seems that big investments are needed for cellular sorry.
I just want to pick up on some of the points that were raised because they're excellent points. For example, we call this wireless technology cellular. What that means is that you have a limited amount of spectrum and you use it in a cell in a confined geographic area. And as you leave that, you go to a new cell and you can use other frequencies that are hopefully there. And then finally, 2 cells away, you can use the spectrum that you were using in the first cell. So with a scenario with $10,000 base stations, you take a city like New York, you would view this as an urban canyon. So every block would be a base station that would cover 40 subscribers hanging up there, and you just kind of ping pong down, reusing the spectrum throughout all of New York City. On the rural side, one of the problems with base stations in rural areas is that there's nobody there. If there's nobody there, there's no money to be made. So why would I want to spring for, a very nice, a cement pedestal, a nice enclosed vault, nice tower, box of electronics, $500,000 chunk of change. But if it's a $10,000 chunk of change, then we have a different discussion over trying to offer these things in those areas, because then there might actually be someone who would want to go look at Netflix at 8 o'clock at night.
I think that's a really good point, and I was actually gonna extend your argument, Bart. Does anyone know who the largest wireless ISP is in the world? No? Linksys. So you walk around, and everywhere you go, there's Linksys access points that have the name Linksys there, and they've got the largest distribution of wireless broadcast in the world. And I think that really sort of takes this to its almost logical conclusion, which is that if you're looking at traditional cellular deployments or newer, which are not quite technically cellular, LTE type deployments and whatnot, they have very large area coverage and they have very constrained spectrum usage, and the limitations of spectrum that we have today are not technological limitations. It's not that wireless spectrum is somehow limited in the way that, say, AT&T might talk about having not enough spectrum. You need to look at the one level deeper of that, which is that it's limited if you consider the way that a centralized ISP like AT&T or Verizon, using the technology that they're using and the physical infrastructure that they're using, is able to make use of that spectrum. In that case, yes, they do have only a certain amount that they can make use of the spectrum that they have bought from the government and other ISPs. But just like the $10,000 base station that Bart was talking about, where you can run them every block, well, and you can actually make use of much denser networks of broadcasters and cover much more efficiently using the existing spectrum. You can do the same, just sort of dividing it up even more. It's the same way that integration works. You keep slicing thinner and thinner pieces, and all of a sudden everything just sort of comes together. And so Wi-Fi as a technology for local distribution is an excellent example of that, where you have, I was in Dumbo the other day, there were, I was standing on one block, one street corner, over 700 broadcasters of Wi-Fi, 700 different access points that were online and visible as you walk down one city block. And if you think about that, you look at cellular, which might have, one for a dozen or 2 dozen square city blocks, versus the $10,000 access router, which has one per city block, to Wi-Fi, which has 700 per city block. All of us, all using the tiniest sliver of spectrum. You sort of get this a much more colorful sense of what it really means to be quote-unquote spectrum limited, or maybe what it means to not actually technically be spectrum limited. The one, getting back to your original question, I think the one part that no one ever talks about very explicitly about what broadband is that it's as much up as it is down. We talk about consumption, but as the iPad has shown, there's as much creation as there is consumption. I could take my iPhone and walk down the street and, using a few different applications, broadcast video over the network when AT&T's network is working sufficiently. Broadcast video out to the entire world. And so for me, broadband is not just consumption bandwidth, but also production bandwidth. And so it doesn't make sense for me to define broadband as, say, 1.5 megabits to a gigabit downstream. It's got to have equal upstream capacity as well.
Yes?
Probably a very nice question. So what is your mean by 700 broadcasters on one block?
So when you have a wireless access point like the Linksys device, it has a name associated with it that your Wi-Fi computer will see. So when you try to connect to a network, you'll see a bunch of different names. It used to be the case that NYC Wireless would talk about how New York City would encounter spectrum issues earlier than anywhere else in the world, just because of the density of population that we have. And so the 700 number which was just an example, it's not actually that unusual, means that my laptop was able to see 700 personal access points on one city block. Walking down one city block, it was able to see 700 different end users that set up an access point that was broadcasting out Wi-Fi signal. Now, they weren't all I wasn't able to use all of them because most of them were locked down, but the fact that there were 700 of them, 700 unique ones out there, was, I thought, particularly interesting.
Let me ask you or Bart, isn't there some tragedy of the commons here? You make this available to everyone, this little sliver of spectrum, 2 gigahertz spectrum, and 700 people want to use it at once to send all these videos. They're all watching whatever it is. They're all watching the same thing, which we see in New York all the time. Everyone's holding up a cell phone camera. And now you're saying, well, they're not going to just take pictures, because I was at a rock concert the other day in my neighborhood. And, there were, several hundred people around. And instead of waving with the music, they were holding up their cameras. So now, Dana says they're all going to be sending videos using Wi-Fi, using the same spectrum. Is that going to work?
Well, not the way that we have it today. I don't know if you have a comment to this part.
Yeah, there's those of you that actually remember tuning your TV with tuner, channel 14 to 51, 400 and 500 megahertz bands, so-called low-power television, and those are very good for penetrating into rooms like this and doing a lot of interesting wireless things. And we'll have to go see what our government, the FCC, decides how they want to do something with this. And there's a lot of spectrum available, and Dave raises a good point that it's if it's free, then the other problem that people don't talk about with the 2.4 gigahertz band is that's exactly where your microwave oven is. So if you want to really have distortion, you're all set.
Yeah, a couple of points. When you talk about spectrum, deficiency, I mean, we're really talking, like networks like LTE in that space. If you look at today, the total spectrum which has been allocated to telecom in US is about 550 megahertz, and the calculations are that in next 5 to 10 years it would be as much as 500 to 800 more. So I appreciate your point, Dina, on that, but right now Wi-Fi, the way Wi-Fi is used, it is an offload mechanism mostly. So you have when the main networks on AT&T and Verizon get congested, a lot of the usage of Wi-Fi it gets offloaded onto Wi-Fi. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not Wi-Fi can be the primary technology. I think it's too premature to say that, but I think right now, the direction we are going in, we definitely have a spectrum problem the way we are going.
I'd like the panel to address two issues regarding to the future of the broadband directions. One is on that, is this a pure market play? For example, is there some regulatory requirement, the certain areas you have to provide, the access for that technology? The second question is that in the broadband wireless, are there players who has critical technology monopoly on certain kind of critical things which is only for those patent holders can play with competitive advantage?
I can address the first one. When we got our authorization in March 2010 to deploy a 4G LTE network using the L-band, this satellite spectrum I was referring to, it came with build-out obligations. So we've got to cover 100 million POPs by the end of 2012, 145 by the end of 2013, and 260 by the end of 2015. So 90% of the population will have to be covered by our network. We will go beyond that ourselves, and we will also license our spectrum to rural operators who are interested in building out in rural territories. But we've got those build-out obligations in our license.
Your second question was about monopoly on the IP, or?
Yes, I mean, is there any critical technology, like choking points, but which patent is owned by certain
That's
players,
a
so
very.
nobody else can really
Well, I think
enter. It's semi-open, but actually closed.
I think, and if I get the drift, I guess in case of CDMA, for example, we all know Qualcomm is the big gorilla, and everybody has to pay a pound of flesh to Qualcomm, and there are lawsuits back and forth, Nokia, Qualcomm, Samsung. It's like business as usual. And the good thing about the 4G technology is LTE, for example, it's very egalitarian, the whole approach, and they're still trying to figure out how the patent portfolio pooling is going to work. But from what I heard, that it's actually very egalitarian in terms of Qualcomm probably owns 11%, ZTE owns 9-10%, Samsung owns 10%, which is always, clearly Qualcomm may not agree to that, but that's kind of more healthy for the ecosystem when one party doesn't kind of hold you hostage. So that hopefully would lead to a better device ecosystem, which we all know is critical for any broadband to take shape. So hopefully, if LTE is where the world is going, and that's what it looks like, the patent situation there is way more democratic rather than where it was at CDMA level.
Let me pick up on this. The one thing we haven't talked about is the display technology. So people have these iPads and their phones that they can stream video with and so forth. So what you'll see in the next 5 years is a whole new generation of displays that will be far more power efficient and far more brilliant in their HD television resolution. And also what complements it is the low end, kind of a Kindle e-ink type of thing, more of a, you know, we haven't talked about the rest of the world, but the bulk of the phones are not sold in New York City. So there's a lot of other interesting displays that are MEMS based, that are very cost effective, and things like liquid crystal displays and OLEDs you'll see dropping in popularity, and it's because people want to look at things, they want to see pictures.